Greetings, everyone, and welcome to our first presentation for Sector 6, Justice and Governance. And our first speaker for the evening is Jamie Metzl. He's a leading technology and geopolitical expert, a science fiction novelist, and faculty member of Singularity University Exponential Medicine and senior fellow of the Atlantic Council. He was appointed in 2019 to the World Health Organization Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing. Jamie previously served in the U.S. National Security Council, State Department, and Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and with the United Nations and Cambodia. He appears regularly on national and international media discussing global issues, and his syndicated columns and other writing are featured in publications around the world. Jamie is the author of A History of the Cambodian Genocide, the historical novel The Depths of the Sea, and the genetic sci-fi thrillers Genesis Code and Eternal Sonata, plus the recent bestseller Hacking Darwin, Genetic Engineering and the Future of Humanity. Jamie holds a Ph.D. from Oxford, a law degree from Harvard Law School, and is a graduate of Brown University. He's founder and chair of One Shared World, a broad and inclusive movement of stakeholders working collaboratively across diverse cultures, communities, ethnicities, organizations, entities, interests, generations, and nations to ensure a better future for humankind and the sustainability of our collective home. Jamie Metzl, welcome to Building the New World.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. If there is a topic that we should be discussing right now, it's how do we build a new world? And it's not that we need to get rid of the old world. It's just that we need to be clear that the world that we have inhabited, even before the pandemic, is in so many deep and fundamental ways broken. So many of us are experiencing tremendous loss and pain and suffering as a result of this terrible crisis. But even before this began, the world in which we occupied, and many of us were comfortable occupying, was deeply unstable and insecure and unsustainable. It was a world where nearly 1 billion people suffered from food insecurity. About 3 billion people lived in abject poverty, where we were using resources at a rate that was destroying our environment. We were wiping out ecosystems, killing millions of species, and we had weapons of mass destruction that were proliferating without an end in sight. That was the world that existed when the virus emerged, and the virus has in many ways pointed its metaphorical finger at us. It's shown us who we are in our great strengths, and we've certainly seen great stories of people and communities coming together to fight back, and our terrible weakness, because what we are seeing more than anything is that our vulnerable people are most exposed to this deadly scourge. But we've also seen that our world is deeply interconnected, that it's not that there is an us and them for the virus, because what does a virus do? A virus is seeking hosts. And we are those hosts. If we want to defeat the virus, one thing that we can do is fight the virus, and we must. But the other thing that we need to do is to fortify the hosts. And that's the essential message of this moment, is that our vulnerability, each of our vulnerability, is connected to the vulnerability of everybody else. We are only each as safe as we all are safe. And that's why at this terrible moment, there's no us and them. There's no us versus them. There's just we humans, who have to come together to not just end this pandemic, but find a way to address our greatest global challenges, including pandemics, obviously, public health, the destruction of our ecosystem, global warming, proliferating weapons of mass destruction, systemic poverty and inequality. The list goes on and on. The common denominator is that we have global problems, but we don't have global solutions. And we can understand in many ways why that is. Our species has very quickly gone from a bunch of roving small bands of nomads to being a global species with not just global reach, but global power. The power to destroy the world through our weapons, the power, as I write about in my book, Hacking Darwin, to recreate all of life on Earth. The power, in other words, that for millennia we have attributed to our gods. We now have the power of gods. And the question is, can we use those powers wisely? And that's why we have to take a very close look at our governance. We have to ask the big and fundamental question, are we prepared to address these challenges? None of you would be here. This conference would not exist if we thought we had already answered that question. We haven't answered that question. But there's an urgency of this moment now that more than 1 million people have died from the pandemic. We're estimating there'll be about $82 trillion of economic loss over 5 years as a result of the pandemic. And if we can't recognize this opportunity to have a tough look at ourselves and figure out what we need to change in order not just to thrive, but to survive, our species will be at great and ultimately existential risk. There have been times in the past where great wars have forced change upon communities and upon the world. And that certainly is one of the options for us. If we have a third world war involving nuclear detonations or other weapons of mass destruction, you can be sure that people will come out of their bunkers, climb out of their holes, and raise some pretty fundamental questions and recognize that the status quo, even the status quo that we still have today, is not sustainable. And at that point, we would have to imagine what a better world might look like and how we can build it. But rather than wait for that kind of catastrophe in order to ask those questions, it behooves us to ask those essential questions now. And we can use our experience of the virus to guide us in that process. And I think that what we need to do is to have, in many ways, 3 pillars of that conversation. The first is to understand what has happened and what is happening now and what it means. The second is to orient ourselves and to imagine the kind of world that we would like to build. And the third is to pivot and begin laying the foundations for the world that we would like to inhabit. So let's take those 3 pillars one at a time. The first is understanding. If we look in the narrowest possible way of what's happening with this pandemic, what we will say and what we'll recognize is that we are experiencing a deadly virus. Viruses have been, as many of you know, around for billions of years. They're one of the most successful life forms on Earth, if you consider them to be life forms. And there's no doubt that our human destruction of ecosystems has placed us in closer contact with wild animals that we didn't have this level of contact with in the past. And that is a very significant part of the story of the growth in the frequency of deadly pathogenic outbreaks over recent years. It is connected to our destruction of ecosystems and global warming, and there's really no doubt about that. But let's begin to have a wider look of why we're in this crisis. And when we do that, so much is at stake. We owe ourselves a level of brutal honesty, even though that's sometimes can be very difficult. So why are we experiencing this pandemic? Well, we can also look at the origins of the pandemic. There are some people who say that the pandemic comes from a series of natural zoonotic animal-to-animal jumps that happened in the wild. Certainly, we were able to trace that kind of history in the 2003 SARS outbreak with a pretty high level of accuracy. So far, there is almost no evidence of that kind of animal-to-animal transmission in the wild. As a matter of fact, if that had happened, we would expect to see, especially because these kinds of pathogenic outbreaks tend to happen in tropical areas like southern China, we would have been likely to see a series of outbreaks between southern China, perhaps Yunnan province, and Wuhan. We haven't seen any of that. Is it possible there could be some missing link of zoonotic jump? It's possible in the wild. I would put maybe a 10 or 15% likelihood of that happening. But what's the other story? What is, in my view, the by far most likely origin of this pandemic? Well, let's have a little history. In 2012, 6 miners went into a cave, a copper mine in Yunnan province in tropical southern China, which was infested by bats. They all developed terrible symptoms that were exactly the same as COVID-19 symptoms. 3 of those 6 died, as a matter of fact. Blood samples were taken from these men, and the virus was extracted. Where was the virus sent? To the one city in China with a level 4 virology institute. You know where that is, in Wuhan. And Wuhan Institute of Virology had an advanced program for studying bat coronaviruses. Not just studying, but using controversial gain of function experimentation methods, which is different from genetic engineering. What this involves is putting a virus and a cell culture together in a dish, essentially, and having them interact with each other. And what that does is it speeds up the quote unquote natural evolutionary process. So we know that they were doing gain of function research on bat coronaviruses. We know that the Wuhan Institute of Virology had a spotty security record. And we know that when the SARS-CoV-2 virus showed up and was sequenced, the closest known genetic relative to SARS-CoV-2 was, you guessed it, the virus that was extracted from these miners from the 2012 incident. And then we know that China began, starting with local authorities, a massive cover-up campaign that involved silencing the whistleblowers, and that's been pretty well covered in the media, destroying viral samples, forcing scientists to not speak publicly, disappearing citizen scientists, prematurely disinfecting the market, even though Chinese authorities were telling a story that they knew to be untrue, that the pandemic originated in the market. And worst, perhaps, is they blocked World Health Organization investigators from getting visas to even come to Wuhan for nearly a month. And so when we ask, why are we experiencing this pandemic? Certainly we need to be very, very honest that we are experiencing this because China failed to respond adequately in the critical first month. And because of that, a stove fire became a kitchen fire, became a house fire, became a city fire, became a world fire. But even starting from that basis, there is a reason why 7 people have died in Taiwan of COVID-19, and now over 200,000 have died in the United States. And that's not because of the Chinese origins of the virus. It's because of the catastrophic fundamental failure by the United States, and particularly the Trump administration, to respond effectively. And we need to be honest. And it wasn't just the Trump administration. Since at least the Reagan administration, the US government and the US public has been suffering from an autoimmune disease. When Ronald Reagan said the government isn't the solution, the government is the problem, that began a process, in many ways a war by American people against their own government. And that's one of the reasons why we decimated our public health infrastructure. It's one of the reasons why we weren't as prepared as we needed to be. And it wasn't just the United States. We saw those kinds of failures in other countries, whether South Africa, Brazil, which had a very similar trajectory with similar leadership to the United States, India, and others. So clearly, we have seen failure by national governments around the world, and some other examples like New Zealand and Singapore and South Korea, we've seen actually some shining examples. As Stephen mentioned, I'm an advisor to the World Health Organization, and I'm a huge fan of the WHO and of Dr. Tedros Adhanom, the Director General. But we need to be honest that the World Health Organization failed in its response to COVID-19. Why did it fail? It certainly didn't sound the alarm early enough, and it wasn't able to send its investigators, its emergency response team to China on day one. They had to wait, as I mentioned, for nearly a month. But why did they fail? Why did they not have a surveillance system? Why were their investigators not empowered to intervene, to go anywhere on Earth on a moment's notice? How our world is organized, because the WHO didn't have those powers because there's something wrong with the WHO. It's because our states did not give the WHO the authorities and the mandate and the resources that it needs to do the job that we all need it to do to keep us safe. Why was that? We need to go back in history. And I think you all know this as part of this community. Maybe a good place to start is 1648, the Peace of Westphalia, after the bloody 30 Years' War that killed a fifth of everyone in Europe. And what the Peace of Westphalia did was establish our modern concept of the nation state. And we know through the history of the 19th, 17th, the late 17th, 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, that world of competing nation states, even after it was exported to the rest of the world through colonialism, proved inherently unstable. And states were rising and falling and challenging each other. And after two bloody world wars, we finally realized that we needed to do something more. And that was why some forward-looking, brilliant, I would say, leaders and countries came together under US leadership in 1945 in San Francisco and laid the foundation not just for the United Nations, not just for this idea that we need to have an international system that is moderating the worst impulses of states, but laid the foundation for much of the post-war international order, this system that, for all of its flaws, has benefited so many of us in such a deep and fundamental way. And for all of the shortcomings, I actually do agree with Steven Pinker that by most measures, most everyone on Earth is better off than they would otherwise have been, but for this incredible sprint of progress. That doesn't mean they're as well off as they should be, as we would like them to be, as we need them to be. We now have to realize, but we are all better off. But if this moment is teaching us anything, it's that this system has failed. We don't have a World Health Organization that can end and prevent pandemics. We don't have a global climate change or environmental infrastructure that can prevent the destruction of our planet. We don't have a nuclear or weapons of mass destruction non-proliferation regime that can prevent these weapons of horrible mass murder from being spread across the globe. We don't have a global development infrastructure that can make sure that billions of our fellow humans, our brothers and sisters, aren't living in filth with terrible fear that they won't be able to provide for their children. We have the resources and the capacity to achieve all of those things. We haven't done it. And the reason we haven't done it is that we haven't made a fundamental next shift. Because although the United Nations system is a tremendous improvement on everything that went before it, it's certainly not doing the job that we need to do. And the primary reason why this is the case is not United Nations bureaucrats, although I'm sure some could be better and some are great. It's that our states have not given international organization the authority or the ability to do that job. That's just what we saw with the WHO, and we're seeing it everywhere. I'm not saying that we need to get rid of states. Actually, states are critically important. I am a proud American citizen. I'm the son, my father and grandparents were refugees fleeing Nazism. And I think it's okay for everyone to love our countries. And we should live in countries that are worthy of being loved. But that doesn't mean that we should continue to do what we are doing, which is instruct our leaders to fight for our narrow interests, whether it's our local or national narrow interests, at the expense of our common interest. And our leaders are doing exactly the job we've hired them to do based on the incentive structure that we have created for them. So if we want to think about different outcomes, we need to think about changing incentive structures. And we need to do that really on every level. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but let me go to my second pillar. The first pillar is understanding. The second pillar is orienting. When we are traveling without our GPS and our ancestors were traveling, crossing oceans or vast deserts, how did we navigate? We navigated by the stars. We needed to know where the North Star was as our reference point so we could set out our journey. We needed to imagine where we were going. In this case, imagine the world that we'd like to build, but then think, what are our reference points that will allow us to know where we're going, to stay on the path where we are heading? And those reference points, our North Star, must be our values. We are living in a world of dramatic change. But despite that change, and whether it's because of the pandemic or revolutionary technology or so many other things, if we lose sight of the North Star, we're lost. And that North Star is our essential values. We don't need to invent new values. Our ancestors have been working for thousands of years to come up with some beautiful value systems. Every tradition, every faith community has at its core a value system about making the world a better place. We don't need to reinvent those. But what we need to make sure that we're doing is applying our best values to help guide us to where we are going. And that's why every conversation about structure, about technology, about the future must be grounded in an appreciation of values and the centrality of values in every aspect of our decision making. And the third pillar is pivot, because once we understand the situation that we're facing, and once we orient ourselves, we've got to pivot and we've got to start marching toward the world that we want to build. We've got to start laying the foundations for a better future. And that's what's so essential at this moment. We must pause for a moment to mourn all that we have lost and all the people we have lost during this pandemic. But this is also a moment of churn. It's a moment where that loss and change and pain is creating new opportunities, whether we like it or not. I said in the early days of this pandemic that the old world, our old lives, are not coming back, and they're not. But we now have an opportunity to actually build back better. And that's the challenge, because if we can do it, I have no doubt that our future can be much greater than our past. But if we can't do it, if we continue on the path of our status quo, we will be in grave danger. And that job is the responsibility of all of us. And for me, this really hit me very, very early on in the pandemic. It was in the earliest days of the pandemic. Stephen mentioned that I'm a faculty member for Singularity University. So in the earliest days of the pandemic, I was asked for the Singularity University COVID Summit to give a talk on whether the tools of the genetics revolution were a match for the pandemic. And that morning, I woke up and I had this unsettling feeling that that wasn't the right talk, that I had a talk that I needed to give that was much more important. And I said in my new talk, a lot of what I've just told you, that it doesn't matter. My talk was supposed to be on whether the tools of the genetics revolution were a match for the pandemic. But in my talk, I said it doesn't matter. Even though we have these miraculous, godlike technologies that ultimately we will be able to use to defeat this pandemic. In an ultimate sense, it doesn't matter whether we beat this pandemic, because if we beat this one, there'll be another one. And we're entering the age of synthetic biology, where these new pathogens will be a lot trickier than even this very tricky SARS-CoV-2 virus. Because if we fix this one pandemic, we have future pandemics. If we address the entire issue of pandemics, we still haven't solved climate change or ecosystem destruction or any of those global common issues that I've discussed previously. And so the only way that it will matter, I mean, certainly we have to do everything to address the pandemic, but the only way that that's ultimately going to matter is if we can solve once and for all our global collective action problem, because there is this mismatch between global problems and non-global solutions. So in that talk in the early days of the pandemic, what I said, like I said to you, is that there is an incentive structure for our leaders. If we want to change that, we've actually got to do it. There's no amount of global citizen concerts or waving our iPhones back and forth in the air or singing songs that is going to change the fundamental power structure of the world. The only way I believe that we can do that is by building an inclusive global social movement, a constituency that is demanding a relevant seat at the table for our common interests as humans sharing the same planet. That's what we need to do, in my view. So I gave that talk. The video of that talk went viral. I stayed up all night. A couple of nights later, I drafted what I called a Declaration of Global Interdependence, put that up on my website. That went viral. And then I did what we all do in these days of the pandemic. I called a global Zoom meeting with just the people from my list. On that first meeting on April 1st, we had 130 people from 25 countries, and the energy was just palpable. We had people from all around the world, ranging from former prime ministers, governors, famous artists, to high school kids who were just pissed off that the world that our generations had left them was so broken. And everybody came together. We divided up into working groups, and people worked day and night around the world for the next 35 days, redrafting the Declaration of Interdependence, which has now been translated into 19 languages. And 35 days later, on May 6th, we launched One Shared World, which has grown insanely since those days. We're now a community of people in 112 countries. We launched our Rise or Fall Together report, calling for emergency response to address the urgent needs of the world's most vulnerable populations. We're now launching a major campaign calling on G20 leaders to ensure that everyone on Earth has access to safe water, basic sanitation and hygiene, and essential pandemic preparedness by 2030. 3 weeks ago, we held our Global Interdependence Summit, which had 1.2 million participants from nearly 100 countries. The Dalai Lama spoke, World Health Organization Director General Dr. Tedros Adhanom spoke, LA Mayor Eric Garcetti, and so many others. We also had incredible artistic performances drawing on the common language of our humanity by the likes of opera superstar Renee Fleming and so many others. But as I said, it's going to take a lot more than beautiful songs or even beautiful and inspiring words. We all need to come together to become an irresistible social and political force driving this change. There are lots of parallels for how this can be done and has been done. In the United States, we had a civil rights movement of people who felt that their needs weren't being adequately represented by the political culture. They organized, they marched, and they forced, in many ways, the government to respond, not by overthrowing the government, not by creating a parallel government, but by altering the DNA of the government that was already representing them. The Green parties have done the same in many parts of the world. Working from a common set of principles, they have realized these aspirations in some very different political contexts. We don't need a unified global interdependence movement. We need a collective, inclusive movement of people of all backgrounds, organizations of all types, creating this kind of empowered constituency, demanding that our national and international organizations do a better job of balancing narrower and broader interests for the common good. That is the name of the game. And it's not as if this is just a strategy that needs to be realized on the national level. Gandhi understood better than everybody else that for these kinds of movements to succeed, there needs to be a connection between the broad goal, in his case, independence and dignity for India, and the action of each individual, such as spinning their own clothing. And there was a connection between those two things. The only way that our world is going to change is with systemic change. But the only way systemic change can happen is if there is a nexus between our broad claims for systems change and the role that every individual plays. What can people do? Well, the first thing is we all need to educate ourselves. We've created all sorts of curriculums at the oneshared.world website that can help you with that process. But there are lots of other ways that people can educate. Second, we all need to look at the systems and communities of which we are a part and say, what can I do to change that system? We believe and are calling for every organization on earth, every government, every political party, every business, every civil society organization to update their platform or mission statement to include a recognition of the mutual responsibilities of our interdependence. Those are the key words for the shift that we need to see. Now, I know there are many people in this community and likely listening to this talk who for decades have been advocating new models of world government. And I know that there are platforms, there are all kinds of bodies that have been negotiated for decades. And while I have enormous respect for that aspiration, I think fighting for that now is a mistake. And the reason why is not because it's a good idea, not because it's a bad idea, not because we can't imagine a world that would have that kind of world government. It's because we have an existing power structure and we need to make that structure work for everyone. If we divert everybody's attention to imagining some whole new system that is going to be rejected by the existing power structure, we're going to use all of this energy. And at the end of the day, we aren't going to succeed in creating some kind of new world government out of whole cloth. And even if we do, we have no guarantees that that world will be at all better or safer than the one that we have now. Does that make me conservative? Maybe a little bit it does. because what is at stake right now are people's lives, people's livelihoods. We know that our world is broken, but I certainly believe that we have to have an aggressive incrementalism that understands that we live in a world with its own power structures. It was an enormous deal to create the United Nations system. It failed in the interwar years as the League of Nations. It took two things. One, the devastation of the Second World War, and two, a global emerging hegemon in the United States that was determined to build this new kind of model. And we are not in that situation right now. That doesn't mean that the crisis we're facing is not real. It means that we, in my view, should not divert our energies to imagining an entirely other system when we don't have a path, a real path for building it. We do have a real path for building an empowered global constituency that will demand that every one of our institutions do a much better job of balancing our narrow and broad or collective interests. In my view, that's what we need to do, because we are at a moment very similar to 1918 after the First World War, when there were two very different visions of the future. There was the progressive idealist vision of Woodrow Wilson and the 14 Points and the League of Nations. And there were other people who had a very, very different view of a world inspired by nationalism, by building walls and exclusion. And that second group won because they understood technology, they understood power. They weren't dreaming in the clouds. They were focusing on building the kind of world that they wanted to see, as terrible and destructive as that is. We idealists, and I think everybody who's joining us today is an idealist, we can't afford to be fairy tale idealists. We need to be tough idealists. We need to be pragmatic idealists. We need to win for the values we support. Because if we don't win, the future could be very dark for all of us. But if we do win, there's a much better world that awaits. So thank you very much. Let me stop there, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and answering any questions you may have.
All right, Jamie, thank you so much. Let me just get the video squared away here, and we're going to go to Q&A. All right, so thank you for the talk. Appreciate everything that you're doing. And then as we move into our first question, one of several that have come in, it is, how do we enforce universal values without a binding world court system?
So my view is it would be great if we had universal values, we could articulate what they were and then force everybody to do that thing. And we've certainly tried that. And right now we have the Genocide Declaration, which tries to be universal. It's very hard to hold countries accountable. And you look at, it's arguable, but what some say is genocide now happening by one of the most powerful countries in the world against its Uyghur and perhaps Tibetan populations, and there's nothing the rest of the world is willing to do. So I get, it certainly makes sense to me that if someone said you have a magic wand and you can fundamentally transform the world, how do you want to do it? Well, I would say, let's articulate a common set of universal values, and we have that in many ways in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and to a lesser extent the UN Charter. And then let's have an empowered enforcement mechanism that can implement those things. That would be great. That is so far away from the world that we inhabit that I think that it's, in my mind, it's smarter to ask, or maybe better, I should say, to ask a question, how can we work toward establishing what those universal principles even are? Because right now we're going the other way. We're seeing a de-universalization of values. We aren't just seeing a country like China stepping away from principles of universal human rights. We're seeing the United States, which has been the bulwark of efforts to support human rights globally, warts and all, also stepping away. And it's only small countries that are in many ways, or countries like Germany and others, that are standing up for these principles. So we have to, unfortunately, fight this fight again. We have to fight the fight for universal principles. And that means we have to build a global movement of people, because our leaders aren't doing it. And they're not doing it because they're not incentivized to do it. And so there's no path from here to a binding international court that is implementing some kind of universal values, because we don't have universal values and we don't have the court. And so if we want to have an exercise of just fairy tale imagining, we can do that. But what we need to do, in my mind, is build this wall from the ground up. And we have to build a people's movement that's demanding change. Because I said in the beginning, there are two paths to change. One is world war. One is an inclusive, hopeful social movement that creates its own political force.
Let me ask a quick follow-up before we get to the next question that's posted on the screen there. So did you find in the creation of the Declaration of Global Interdependence that those universal values were organically being built into it?
So yeah, it was a great question. So what I and then we did was to say, it's not that we can't articulate what universal values are. I mean, in my view, the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the Sustainable Development Goals, I mean, it's pretty good. I mean, we could reopen negotiations. I don't think we would do much better than those documents. So those exist, and our declaration, our One Shared World Declaration of Interdependence, is grounded in those. I don't think that we need to renegotiate what they are, but what I think we need to do is to build a global movement that demands that they be realized. And connecting to the last question, we can't do it through the institution of a court until we succeed in making the case for these principles. I mean, if we were to succeed in having countries around the world, international organizations, recognize the centrality of these principles, then we would be different, in a different situation. And that's why this is such an interesting moment, because one way to say, well, universal supporting human rights and addressing the emergency needs or the core needs of the world's most vulnerable populations is charity. And certainly it's very charitable. But if our framework is charity, that, there's a moral thing to do and help other people, some people will want to do that and some people won't. But what the virus and the pandemic have shown us is this isn't about charity. It's about self-preservation. We are making ourselves sick collectively by not solving these big global problems. By solving them, we make ourselves safer and healthier. And in my mind, that's the case. And that's what we need to organize around.
All right, thank you. So, and then speaking of the UN, the next question here, the UN will not be a democratic body until the Security Council is abolished. How can we achieve such a radical change at the UN when the powerful Security Council nations oppose such a change?
So I disagree with the question. So let's just say you abolish the Security Council and then you have the General Assembly making decisions based on what? Based on one country, one vote. So Vanuatu has the same voice as China. We live in a world where power exists. And that was what I was saying about fairy tales. And I just think that it's actually dangerous for influential people to be telling fairy tales. And that doesn't mean, and so if this community aspires to really address these problems, in my view, it's a terrible, dangerous error to call for things like abolishing the Security Council, because there's not a plan B. And so, yes, we need to reform the Security Council. Yes, we need to think differently about global power. But it took a world war to create this deeply flawed and highly imperfect institution. What is going to happen if we abolish it with no process and no prospect of creating something better to fill its place, what do we get? Certainly, maybe you could get less influence from China and Russia and the United States. But one possibility is you just get mayhem. It's not necessarily the case that if we abolish these systems, we get something better. There's a very real likelihood that we get something worse. I mean, I'm an idealistic Hobbesian, but without institutions, without structures, we will see human experience will be what it's been in the past, with all kinds of dangerous competition and destruction. So I'm not against reform, but just saying let's abolish the Security Council without a model of what happens. And again, I don't mean a fairy tale model. I mean a real model of what is going to replace it, how that's going to be better, how we're going to get buy-in for that. If we just destroy without create, or we just destroy something that exists in the name of a fantasy that we're laying in bed imagining, it's very likely, in my view, we'll end up with something much worse.
Okay, thank you. The next question then is, there have been many declarations of interdependence, starting with Henry Wallace in 1933, Will Durant in 1944, etc. Why not craft an actual constitution for the planet and seek its adoptions? Seems like smaller countries would jump on such a plan, and it could be a true bottom-up movement.
Yeah, again, I think we're getting versions of the same question, and I'll just give you versions of my same answer. What does that even mean? What is a constitution for the planet? How would it be ratified? How does that relate to the existing power structures in the world? What we need to do is to build a normative movement. I mean, if people want to have a constitution for the planet, there's nothing wrong with it. It's not going to go anywhere. The existing power structures aren't going to just adopt it and say, oh, sorry. It's certainly a nice idea and it's not hurting anything. But I think that we need to articulate what the world is that we would like to see on a normative level. And we need to build a popular movement around those principles. And that's going to take time and it's going to take doing. There's no one magic instrument, a constitution, abolishing the Security Council, adoption. What does adoption even mean? And where does the authority come from for that adoption? And certainly there are models. You could say, well, it's one country, one vote, and you rally a bunch of small countries. But you're not going to tell China, oh, Laos and Suriname have come together and they've signed a constitution, and therefore you should do X, Y, and Z. It's not going to happen. And that's why, again, if the assumption is, and I love Borges, and Borges has these wonderful stories of obscure scholars in obscurity imagining new worlds that over time become real. And that's a great thing to do. I have nothing against it. But if there's a movement that actually seeks to drive real change in the world, we need to ground ourselves in realities of the world. That doesn't mean we're not imagining better. That doesn't mean we don't have our North Star of where we'd like to be. But these broad declarations, I just think it can take a lot of energy. It's not going to go anywhere unless the strategy is, well, we'll have all this stuff laying in wait, and maybe someday there'll be a massive thermonuclear war and civilization will be destroyed, and we'll need, it's like Battlestar Galactica, the remake, we'll need to start over from scratch. And then somebody will have in some kind of lockbox buried under the ground these constitutions and documents that people have worked on for years. That's one scenario. But my thought is, let's try to be a little bit practical and recognize we need to build a movement, and the movement is around principles. And that movement has to, the primary focus is not fairy tales. It's trying to influence existing power structures so that they can behave better. And that's certainly with the civil rights movement in the United States. They could have had a strategy of creating a new constitution, creating a new government, seceding from the country. They didn't. Their goal was, we're going to change the existing country to better reflect our interests. That's what we need to do.
So, and if I'm hearing you right, the movement, the power of the movement has the influence over the power structures.
That's exactly it. The goal is to change the incentive structures for the leaders, for the power structures, because the amount of energy that's required to fundamentally change the structures themselves is so much greater than most of us can do. It tends to only happen after massive world wars. And so I just think that we have a question of just how do we use our energy? And we need, in my view, to use those energy to change the existing power structures, to not replace them, but to get them to act differently. And there are lots of great examples of governments and others and businesses that have behaved differently. I'm an advisor to Walmart. There was a lot of years when Walmart was the worst corporate actor on environment. Now Walmart is really a model for other companies. The British government was one of the leading proponents of slavery. We had an anti-slavery movement that grew and became very powerful. It shifted the behavior of the British government to actually start leading efforts to end slavery. That's where the power is, and there are lots of great examples.
Yeah. And then on the subject of power, our next question, do you believe the power elite are planning, quote unquote, one world order? That is Team Dark's version of globalization. What is Team Light's version, if not democratic world law?
So again, I imagine that the same person is writing all of these questions. I don't know, but I know this is is there Team Dark that is planning some kind of global world order? I certainly don't know, but I very much would agree that globalization has helped some people and it's hurt other people. And that's the fundamental flaw of globalization. That's a primary reason why we're seeing such a backlash against it. There were big winners and big losers. And then those people in the counting business were just averaging out the benefits and the losses. And they were saying, well, this is driving GDP growth. But we weren't measuring the misery that was included in those GDP figures. So I don't know whether there are people in black helicopters and the Illuminati and they're planning some kind of big global system. But I do know, whatever it's called, if you want to call it Team Light, fine, that most people, probably everybody on Earth, we share some pretty fundamental common interests. And we want to have safe water and basic sanitation and food and education and a healthy environment and not be devastated by pandemics. There are all these kinds of things that we share. And yet we've organized ourselves into these institutions, as I was mentioning before, who are constantly competing with each other to our benefit. And so if we want to call this Team Light, whatever it is, we need to have a global political movement that's bringing us together to fight for our common needs. And that's what we don't have. And that's what we're trying to build.
Yeah. Our next question then is, how do we get the elected leaders to be accountable to the people for their actions? When the current president took office, millions of Americans took to the streets and were ignored. The BLM movement's cries for justice and equality are ignored. When will the people be heard? How will your new declaration really represent the people?
Yeah, I think it's great. And that's why we have to look at the nuts and bolts of power. And we need to fight these little boring practical fights. In the United States, issues like campaign finance reform are essential to asking questions of who has a voice. Because if a little bit of voice comes from voting and a lot of voice comes from making financial contributions, how is that fair? We need to look at reform in the Electoral College, because it can't be that when electing President of the United States, the will of the people can be so fundamentally thwarted. We have to look at how our primaries are structured, because right now with our primary system, it forces people on the right and the left to go far left or go far right in order to win those primary voters. And that's causing a division. And it's meaning that tiny percentages of the voters are actually getting a huge and outsized influence. And so when we look at these issues of people who are feeling disempowered, we have to break it down, not into this, we can't just ask the big abstract question of disempowerment. We have to break it down into those structures, and we have to really roll up our sleeves and fight these little technical fights. Certainly the Republicans in the United States for decades have had a concerted strategy. As a matter of fact, it's probably one of their core strategies today of disempowering people. They know that there just aren't enough Republicans demographically in this country to sustain Republican leadership in lots of institutions at every level. So, but if they can motivate their base and disempower people by blocking by blocking their ability to vote, that's another way to get there. So all of these fights are really just essentially necessary. And the fights need to happen on all sides. I mean, this is a US focus, but we live in a democracy. And in a democracy, we need to find opportunities for people to come together. When there are disparities of voice, that makes it really difficult, because how can you have a meaningful conversation when one person's voice is so much louder than somebody else's? And that's why we need to be very, very careful about these kinds of abuses, because we have to come together. And those of us who are critical of people going to Trump rallies and not wearing masks because we're saying we have a collective interest in safety and we all have a role to play in that, I believe should be equally critical of people who are unilaterally deciding to pull down statues because they don't like them, even statues that I don't like. And we have to find, to live in a democracy, we need to make the democracy work. And our democracy in the United States is not working nearly as well as it needs to be. But we need to recognize that governance is about compromise. It's not about being a purist or one group having their way entirely. And it's difficult, it's challenging. And that's why these kinds of dialogues are so important. That's why working on the nuts and bolts is also so important.
Yeah. And then our next question is, what is the exact incentive that you think will change the power elite and force/entice them to accept universal moral values?
So universal moral values is a big concept, but certainly, as I was saying before, I mean, right now, what are the incentives that drive our leaders, and that whether they're power elite? I mean, it's just the second somebody, even a humble person, gets elected. Again, I'm sorry to make this too American. I know we're talking a global issue. They enter this incentive structure, whether they were elite the day before or not. They're now in an environment where they have an incentive structure, and it's connected to campaign finance rules. What are the resources that they need in order to keep their jobs? And who are the people who can provide those resources? Who has access to our leaders? So what information are they getting? And then third, and most importantly, what are their constituents? How are their constituents communicating to them about their interests? And it is just the case in democracies that single issue constituencies can be more effective than broad constituencies whose goals can be more vague or at least distributed. And so if we want our leaders to behave differently, we need to organize around that behavior. And we see, you can tell from my view. I mean, one of my great mentors in life is the late Richard Holbrooke, who was the great American diplomat who brought peace to the former Yugoslavia. But he did it not by articulating broad principles, but by recognizing that there is a world of power and a world of politics. And we have to fight for what we believe in. And so we have to fight within the political arena to make clear that these values are things that are what we want our leaders to do. And you can criticize, as I do, an organization like the NRA, but you can't discount the fact that they've actually been pretty effective. You can criticize AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, but you can't discount that they've been effective. if we want change, we need to organize. We need to organize to drive that change. And there are lots of models for how to do that. And in my view, none of them involve smashing things. Everything involves organizing.
Are there, just a quick follow-up before we get to the next question, you mentioned like as people come in, and again, will be a US-centric follow-up to that question, like a representative coming into Congress and they're in a system that's been there and established and has the pattern it does, and it's been that way for a long time. Do you have examples of elected officials that you've seen come in and have started to work effectively in the system to begin that pivot that you talked about?
Yeah. So there's two pieces of the pivot. One are the elected officials themselves, and certainly there are different examples of people who've done things differently. I'm not a huge fan of AOC and quote unquote the squad, but they certainly have shaken things up in Congress by trying to appeal to a different constituency and bringing a new power source, which was their public appeal and their engagement through social media and the voice that they had. And so I think it's at least a very interesting model. And then we have people, again, sorry to be so US focused, who are coming in and who are trying to find common ground through quiet negotiations. And the challenge that we have with that is increasingly the currency of power is attention. That just like AOC was able to garner all of that attention and translate that into power, which gave her more power than people who've been in Congress for decades. And the currency of attention is troublemaking. And so the more, and Trump knows this, and AOC knows this, and Boris Johnson knows this, the more trouble you can make, the more attention you get, the more power you have. So we've also got to break that cycle, and we have to reward the people who are trying to find answers. The grandstanders are getting all the attention. We need to reward people who are finding those answers. So one piece of this is we need to build the constituency that recognizes what they're doing. But second is I know everybody's talking these days about this social dilemma film, but we need to make sure that the playing field is as balanced as it can be. And we have all these social media systems that are pushing us into these little ideological enclaves that are pushing us toward these extreme environments where the biggest troublemakers are getting most of the power. And that's why, again, a lot of this stuff is really nuts and bolts. But revolutions, in my mind, are won through smart strategies focusing on the nuts and bolts.
Yeah. So what would you say to something like, famously, recently John Lewis said, cause good trouble.
Good trouble. Yeah. I'm not against trouble.
Yeah.
I'm saying be strategic in what we're trying to do. So, that was, a lot of people are talking in BLM and certainly I'm sure most people who are listening now, like me, are extremely sympathetic to the frustrations, the anger, all of these feelings that a lot of people share because of the injustice that we're seeing. But our goal has to be building empowered constituencies that can fight to build the kind of world that we would like to live in. And I think that has to be what we're doing. There's so much commonality between the terrible suffering that many people of all backgrounds are facing in all parts of our country and all parts of the world. That's the coalition that we need to build. Race is a piece of that, but we need to be building alliances around our common traits. And then, though, those alliances need to focus on achieving strategic goals. I would have loved for those BLM protests to be as strategic as the Martin Luther King protests were. There was a clear goal. Thurgood Marshall laid out the path. There was a connection between what happened at the lunch counters and the protests. There was huge amounts of education, consciousness raising, training for people. Like, that's what a movement looks like. And that's what we need to see to drive change. As frustrated as we are, just going out in the street and yelling and breaking windows and pulling down statues, it actually does, in many ways, the opposite of what we want, because it alienates the partners that we need. And we need to be building coalitions, and we need to be building coalitions with people who we may not agree with on everything, but we agree with enough. Because again, as good as it feels to express our feelings, we need to be focused on having smart strategies and winning for those strategies.
So then our next question from the thread, in the US, legislation led the way to anchor civil rights, with large segments of the US not on board. So why do you think it's far-fetched that world law could lead the way?
Just because we don't have, there's not a thing. In the US, we had a government, we had a revolution to create that government. And then we were able to have these more incremental strategies to change the behavior of that government. If we want to create a world government, we need a mechanism for creating it. And I just don't think that a broad people's movement, unless we have everybody on earth demanding it, and I just don't think there's any chance that that's going to happen, is going to deliver that possibility. I mean, I'm a graduate of Harvard Law School, and my field is international law, and I believe in international law. But as I said before, it just takes a lot of energy to build a whole new system, building a whole new government. I mean, you need a lot of destruction, and then you need construction. And I think that we probably will have a world government, something, at some point in the future. And we've all seen the Federation from Star Trek, and it actually looks pretty good. So I'm not against it. I'm actually quite for it. But what I'm saying is that right now, it's a big world, and we need diversity, and we need these people who are just kind of imagining things, because sometimes the world changes on a dime. I talked about a nuclear war. We could have a nuclear war 5 minutes from now, and then we will be so grateful that there was a small group of people who had the foresight to plan for over decades. And so I think it's great. And I'm sorry if I'm being too strong. I don't want to discourage anybody, and I really have respect for the work that everybody in this community is doing. But what I'm saying is that there's a pretty urgent challenge right now. And in my mind, that's how we get our existing institutions to behave differently. If we should chance upon, I hope not because of catastrophe, an environment where there was a constituency that was capable, not just wanting, capable of building a whole new world government, it'll be great then to have models.
Yeah. And then the next question from the thread is, you mentioned compromise. What can be done when one group is willing to compromise and the other group that holds the votes or power will not? They choose not to move toward the seemingly obvious greater good that represents a majority of the population from both groups.
Yeah. So in my mind, there's two paths. One is to do everything possible to change the incentive structures, to try to drive change within the system. And that is the desired path. And I certainly believe that American democracy and many other democracies have enough flexibility that that goal would be possible. But we all know that there are some examples of cases where people push for change and there isn't a willingness to have that kind of change. And we certainly see it in lots of authoritarian regimes. I've spent a lot of time in North Korea, and in North Korea, there's two models. If you're one of the leaders of North Korea, there's two models. Either you're in power or you're dangling from a tree. There's no middle ground. There's no compromise or process. And so if you are in North Korea, and forgive me for using this extreme example, but I'm doing it to make a point. If you're in North Korea, your path to change is not organizing a political party and registering voters to try to get Kim Jong-un and the Kim family to step aside. You'll get killed in 2 minutes. If you're in North Korea, the only path to reform is probably overthrowing that government. And we don't want to live in those kinds of societies. I certainly don't think that we in the United States live in that world now, that's why the path has to be changing the behavior of the government. But if I was in North Korea, I would say, well, the path is revolution.
Great. Jamie, thank you so much for your presentation, for enlightening us to your work. I know in the tag in your name there, oneshared.world is the website. Is that right?
Yes. So certainly I invite people to go to the oneshared.world website. I'd love for you all to sign the Pledge of Interdependence. If you have 3 hours, I'd love for you to watch our Global Interdependence Summit called Rise or Fall Together. We have a teaching from the Dalai Lama. It's Renee Fleming sings. It's just incredible. We also have education materials and toolkits and curriculums that we encourage you to use in your faith communities, with your families, your schools, and discussion guides. Because the way, in my view, that we're going to build this movement is it begins with a lot of consciousness raising and a lot of education and a lot of conversations. And then we need to build norms, and then we need to organize to strategically drive change.
Great. Thank you so much, Jamie. We really appreciate it. And just thank you for your contribution to the conference.
Really, my pleasure, Stephen, and thanks to everybody.
All right. So as we wrap up here, come back and join us at 7 Eastern when we continue our second session of Justice and Governance with Glenn Martin and Lucido Martins Rodriguez. So we'll see you in a little while. Thanks, everyone.